Hello. Hello. Welcome to day 2 of the World Craft Conference. Today's first panel is The Work of Play, Race and Labor in a Transnational Frame. The first paper will be delivered by Rachael Hutchinson. She's an assistant professor of Japanese at the University of Delaware, and her research interests include 20th century Japanese literature and film, the representation of self and other in narrative texts, censorship and counter-discourse, and immersion and identification in video games. She has written on Occidentalism in Japanese cinema and literature, and she co-edited the anthology Representing the Other, A Critical Approach to Modern Japanese Literature out on Routledge. And she's also published articles on Soul Caliber and Japanese colonialism. She does have a new book, Nagai Kafu's Occidentalism, Defining the Japanese Self. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be talking about Grand Theft Auto San Andreas today. Let's put that there. And I deal with representation and identity in Japanese texts usually. So today I'm looking at a non-Japanese text, but the representation of China in it is very interesting to me. So Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was made by Rockstar Games, originally released for the PlayStation 2 in October 2004. The main character, as you see here, is Carl Johnson, or CJ, a young black American gang member who must negotiate his way through inter-gang warfare and police corruption in order to save his brother and restore peace to his community, Grove Street in Los Santos. The in-game world is a vast, open environment, completely explorable, either on foot or in a number of vehicles. The environment is extremely realistic. Los Santos, as you see here, approximates real-world Los Angeles, while San Francisco and Las Vegas are represented by the in-game cities San Fierro and Las Venturas. The map opens up to the player in stages as missions are passed and the plot develops. And where Los Santos features gang warfare between different black and Latin gangs, San Fierro is dominated by the triads, and Las Venturas features the Italian mafia. Set in the early 1990s, the game features music, fashion, and slang from the period, as well as a riot scene that's highly reminiscent of the Los Angeles riots of 1992. While CJ here has his own agenda, the only way for him to progress in the game is to befriend members of other racial and ethnic groups, most notably Cesar Villalpando in Los Santos and Wu Zimu in San Fierro. So in this paper, I'll focus on the representation of China in the figure of Wu Zimu, how the racial construction is complicated by the variable of disability, and what effect this has on the player's identification with the character. I hope to demonstrate that GTA San Andreas is highly self-reflexive in terms of the way it problematizes race, disability, and player expectations. So if we look at the construction of the character Wu Zimu, he's constructed mainly as a gang leader, but it's impossible to separate this from his Chinese identity because the gang is a triad group. If we look at the physical appearance of Wuzi himself, he's tall, handsome, elegantly dressed, usually surrounded by admiring female assistants or other triad gang members, emphasizing his role as a leader. And we can see this in his first appearance in the game. Here, CJ on the right and his friend Cesar have just finished a car race, and Wu Zimu gets out of his car to congratulate them, and he's got his women there. And in the published game guide, the first mention of Wu Zimu says, a slick, very formal gentleman in black approaches with his entourage. So that's the main image of Wuzi Mu. In terms of character, he's very honest, he values the family and emphasises the idea of duty. He's supremely self-confident in all tasks, well-spoken and a loyal friend. Looking at the wider context and the surroundings of the character, we see the construction of Chinatown as other. And I hope that the slide is clear. This is a common trope of literature, film, and other media that well suits the gangster narrative of this game and makes the triad boss a good ally for the main character, CJ. Rockstar's representation of Chinatown follows convention, with a preponderance of the colour red, a lot of dragon gates, Asian passers-by, usually dressed in black, Chinese characters on shop fronts and street signs, as you see here, and a lot of triad members hanging around the territory with guns. I'll show you an example of realism in the game. On the top, you see the Chinatown gates of San Fierro in the game, and on the bottom, that's a photo of the real Chinatown gates in San Francisco. And actually, the first time I came to San Francisco, I was able to navigate my way, even though I'd never been to the real city, because I'd spent 2 years in San Fierro. This is Wuzi's office. It's decorated in the Chinese style with moon-shaped doors, red lattice cornices, various fans, swords, and Chinese landscape paintings on the walls, and so on. Later in the game, Wuzi opens a casino called the Four Dragons, and it's similarly decked out in flamboyant Oriental style. The outside features a 4-tiered pagoda and a moon gate on the entrance. Here it is. And inside, there are a lot of things like lion dogs, giant Buddhas, and, to quote, Asian-themed game rooms. And here's a close-up of the golden Buddha presiding over a wheel of fortune or similar. So this is a comfortable, normative representation of China as other that players all over the world are familiar with from other media. What I find interesting about this representation is that there's actually 2 sets of visual Orientalism happening in the game. On the one hand, you've got the flamboyant, exotic, red-black colour scheme, the calligraphy, the swords, the Buddhas, and so on. But on the other hand, you've got the minimalist fashion aesthetic worn by Wuzi and all of his gang and the female members of his gang. They've got very simple tailoring, usually black clothing, high collars, sunglasses, and very sleek haircuts. So I think that this points to the imagined China, both the past version and the present version. So Wuzi Mu is established as a conventional Chinese other from his context and his surroundings. But I think that Rockstar makes efforts to normalise Wuzi Mu in the following ways. First, his name is anglicised to Wuzi. He says to CJ, "My friends call me Wuzi." And if you look at the script, it's written this way. This provides a normative relatability to the average North American player. Next, although he often lapses into Cantonese when speaking with his associates, Wuzi has absolutely no Asian accent when he's speaking English. The lack of an accent produces a binary contrast in opposition to other Asian characters in the game, which further establishes Wuzi's normative status. In the mission strand called Wuzi Mu and the Chinese triads, called the Mountain Cloud Boys and the Red Gecko Tong, are directly contrasted against the Vietnamese Da Nang Boys. And this makes an interesting example of good Asian versus bad Asian in the game. And if you look at the negative way that the Vietnamese gang is constructed, they have atrocious accents, very, very thick and hard to understand. They're talked about as snakeheads, which implies human trafficking. And this is actually borne out when CJ has to go and attack their container ship. And one of the containers is found to be full of people. And in the game guide and the in-game instructions, these people are referred to as refugees. But to anyone who's ever heard the term snakehead, it's quite obvious that these people are victims of human trafficking. The snakehead leader is an old ponytailed man practicing sword dancing up on the ship's bridge. And he's really a caricature. When CJ enters the ship's bridge, he tosses CJ a sword, and they have to proceed to fight to the death. And it's quite notable that at this point, CJ loses all ability to choose his weapon. Usually you can cycle through the weapons and choose one, but in this scene you must fight with the sword that he gives you. So that means that he's forced to perform this stereotypical Asian fight scene. And of course, CJ wins. Judging from the generally positive constructions of race in the game, I think that the normative racial demographic of players can be assumed to be white, black, Latino, or Chinese. Strong characters in the game, both good and evil, are found in all these racial groups. But it's only the Vietnamese that are caricatured to this extent, which provides a parody of a non-normative ethnic group. So what's the effect of normalising Woozy Moo? The anglicised name, the lack of an accent, and construction of as a good Asian make Woozy Moo more relatable to the average player. This is helped by the positive relationship quickly built up between Woozy and CJ. On their first meeting, he says, "My friends call me Woozy." Woozy then invites CJ to San Fierro, and he becomes CJ's greatest ally in the game. Now, for the player, goodwill is immediately established because Woozy's invitation means that the map of San Fierro is now open for the player to explore. But what I think is really interesting is how Woozy's normativity is undercut, emphasised and problematised in various ways through the game, resulting in a high degree of self-reflexivity, where the game developers are constantly drawing attention to the constructed nature of the game world. A good example is found in CJ's ignorance of Chinese culture and name pronunciations, which produces a clear disjunction between CJ's knowledge and that of the player. The player has a better idea of character names because they often appear on the screen in text as part of the chapter title of the narrative. For example, the second mission of the Woozy strand is titled Ran Fa Li. In this mission, we meet the head of the Red Gecko Tong, Shukfu Ran Fa Li, who is threatened with assassination. In the next mission, CJ offers to lure the rival Vietnamese gang away from San Fierro by driving Ran Fa Li's car into the Badlands as a decoy. CJ refers to the Tong leader as Mr. Farley. I can't do it because I'm not American. But he runs the syllables together and links them with a very strong R sound, so it sounds like one word, Mr. Farley. And even a player completely unfamiliar with Chinese names can laugh at CJ's mispronunciation here because the text of the chapter titles has given them knowledge unavailable to CJ himself. And this sequence emphasises CJ's status as a complete outsider to Chinese culture, but it also draws a clear line between the character and the player. The most self-reflexive element in the game, however, is the way that the racial construction is complicated by the variable of disability. Woozy Moon is blind. He wears dark glasses throughout the game. CJ doesn't realise that Woozy's blind until he visits Woozy's betting shop in San Fierro, and one of the triad members tells him about the boss's curse. At the same time, CJ is told that the boss has incredible good fortune as if to compensate for his disability. Woozy himself acts as if he's not blind at all. He runs fast, often across the road. He shoots guns. He races cars himself, and so on. Woozy's self-confidence in games like golf and cards is enabled and strengthened by his cronies, who move the putting hole for him and deliberately fold their poker hands so that Woozy will always win. This ploy is highlighted and made fun of when CJ appears in their midst and plays cards to win, prompting some confusion from Woozy, who mutters that he must be having an off day. It's only at the very end of the game when CJ and Woozy are planning a massive bank heist that Woozy reluctantly admits that he might not be the best person to pilot the getaway helicopter. So the effects of Woozy's disability on gameplay and player character identification can be read in two main ways, in terms of humour and in terms of exoticization. Much of the humour stems from the fact that the player encounters Woozy solely through his meetings with CJ, discovering Woozy's blindness when CJ does, feeling CJ's confusion at Woozy's ability to race cars, and laughing along at the visual gags occasioned by Woozy's inability to see. When they first meet in San Fierro, CJ waves his hand in front of Woozy's face. On the first mission, Woozy runs headlong into a wall. CJ plays cars to win, and Woozy admits he shouldn't pilot the helicopter. My favourite visual gag in the game is this, which appears at the beginning of one of the... this is a cutscene that appears at the beginning of a mission, where Woozy and CJ are playing video games together. And I don't know if it's very clear, but they're holding a PS2 controller. So it's a mention in the game that this is a PlayStation game. But of course, Woozy shouldn't be able to play video games, especially seated way over there. Woozy's blindness is a source of humour in the game, and this diffuses negativity that can be associated with disability, but it also places the player in the uncomfortable position of laughing at the blind. The humour starts out as a surface effect, very obviously constructed for the purpose of comedy. But actually, when you look more closely at the way that the humour works, it has a deeper effect of making us question our own attitudes towards blindness and disability in general. And I think this can be seen as self-reflexivity on the part of the game developer. Woozy's blindness also confounds player expectation. Blindness empowers Woozy with mystical skills. How is it that he can run across the road safely, shoot from a car in a successful drive-by, and win car races on his own? This seemingly mystical power adds to the otherness of the Chinese figure. But by making disability into the source or origin of that mystery, it produces a positive exoticization of disability itself. At the same time, however, the representation may also be understood in negative terms, because Woozy's actions go against the grain of player expectations regarding the capabilities of the blind. Player reactions of laughter or disbelief can reinforce initial expectations that a blind character would not be able to achieve certain things, or be limited or otherwise defined by their disabled status. So, because this representation of blindness can be seen as either positive or negative, the game makes the player think both about the way blindness should be represented and the way that the player themselves thinks about blindness. That we laugh at blindness makes us question whether we're really the kind of person who should laugh at blindness. That we think about Woozy's abilities in terms of real-world possibilities highlights the fact that we're playing a game. So player reactions to Woozy's blindness thus point to the fundamental self-reflexivity that's a hallmark of GTA San Andreas. Surface Orientalism and the exotic portrayal of disability are both problematised throughout the game, making the player recognise and question their own assumptions as well as their own reactions. The player is constantly taken out of the diegetic world of the game to recognise their own actions of that as a person playing a game. And in this, I think that GTA San Andreas is a great step forward from GTA Vice City, which had many visual puns and references to 1980s culture from a modern standpoint, very definitely constructed in terms of nostalgia. GTA San Andreas also has a similar kind of nostalgia in terms of the music and fashion, but it's much darker in tone, and the player can't help but be reminded of the 1992 LA riots, Rodney King, racial tension, and so on. In fact, you could argue that the whole game is about combating racism. CJ's brother is seeing a Latina girl, and it's the bonds that CJ forges with the Latin and Chinese communities that allow him to defeat his enemies and progress through the narrative. So, what are the effects of Woozy's dual identity construction in terms of race and disability? You could argue that Woozy's blindness singles out Chinese identity as more markedly different, further exoticizing the Chinese other. Or you could equally argue that blindness as a marker of difference wipes out race, or racial difference as a distinguishing feature. When I began this research, I was going along the lines of argument number one. But as I thought about the problem more deeply, I realised that I was thinking more in terms of argument number 2, and there are a few reasons for this. In as much as China is orientalised in the game, we also see this at work in the representation of other communities, the Italian mafia, the Black American gang culture, the Spanish-speaking Latin community, and so on. All have their instantly recognisable cultural symbols, like the Madonna and Child on the wall that you saw in the first slide. If all the cultural groups are similarly orientalised in the game, then the orientalisation of China doesn't stand out. Similarly, the good guys in the game have a range of racial identities. CJ is African American, Cesar is Latino, Zero is white, Woozy is Chinese, and so on. And in this mix, Woozy alone is marked out as different by his disability. That the marker of difference is disability rather than race allows race to become a subject of exploration in the game. A large part of the narrative deals with racial tension, and the game can be seen as a critical commentary on race relations in California in the 1990s. So if race is no longer acting as a pure marker of difference in the narrative, this also allows the developers to explore serious issues of police oppression, corruption, and brutality, not in terms of race relations, but in terms of good and evil. By making moral standards absolute and not connected to race, GTA San Andreas is able to revisit the Rodney King incident, placing it prominently in the game through the riots at the end of the central narrative. In other words, without Woozy's disability, there would be no mark of physical otherness in the game apart from race. Because Rockstar Games is telling a moral tale about race relations in 1990s California, race can't be allowed to function as the sole side of otherness. What's interesting about this for me is that the presence of Woozy's disability actually elides racial difference in the narrative as a whole. The player identifies closely with a wide range of characters of different racial backgrounds, all of whom work together efficiently to accomplish their goals at the end of the game, whether it's pulling off a massive bank heist together or clearing up the neighbourhood of drugs. This rosy view is balanced by the racial conflicts and tensions throughout the game, although CJ's role is essentially that of a mediator between different racial groups. CJ is the hero because he brings peace to Grove Street and Los Santos after the riots, but he only achieves that hero status through interracial diplomacy and negotiation. And this is the group that's planning the bank heist. You've got the triad members over that side. CJ's here. There's Zero in the middle. And I don't know, I think the other guy is actually just a janitor standing in this scene, but Cesar Villalpando plays a large role in the bank heist. So it's a mixed race group. In conclusion, overall, the duality of Woozy Moo's identity construction adds to the game experience, providing rich narrative immersion and strong player character identification. By the end of the game, Woozy's status as a good friend to both CJ and the player make him a successful and memorable game character, providing a positive image of the Asian male in a major Western game franchise. And thank you for listening.
Our next speaker is Lisa Nakamura, Director and Professor of Asian American Studies, Criticism and Interpretive Theory, Gender and Women's Studies in the Institute of Communications Research, and Media and Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is the author of Digitizing Race, Visual Cultures of the Internet, out on University of Minnesota Press. Also, Cybertypes, Race, Ethnicity, and Identity on the Internet, out on Routledge, and a co-editor of Race in Cyberspace, also out on Routledge. She's editing a collection entitled Digital Race, an Anthology, forthcoming from Routledge, and is working on a new monograph tentatively titled Workers Without Bodies, Towards a Theory of Race and Digital Labor in Virtual Worlds.
Okay, Thanks. I don't need the mic. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks. Oh, I do need it because you're recording this. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's been a really marvelous event with great focus. I think it's great, and it's a time that East Asia is talked about in a more specific way and in a more thoughtful way than it often is. What I'm going to be talking about today is World of Warcraft and the role of East Asia as digital migrants within what had formerly been seen as kind of American game space, but also the way that East Asians are now being viewed more so as digital workers of a particular type, a particularly immiserated kind of artisanal type, as opposed to the consumers they had been seen as in the earlier 2000s. So just to put this in some context, I'm the director of Asian American Studies right now in my day job, not Asian Studies. I've never been to Asia. But I'm talking about this from the perspective that the concepts, prejudices, images, and gaming cultures from and of Asia do affect Asian Americans because they produce Orientalism, a transnational formation, which imagines Asia and Asian players and Asian digital workers as having an immutable shared essence. Techno-Orientalism, a term popularized by both Wendy Chun and David Morley, envisions all Asians within the Asian diaspora as having an affinity for the digital in particular, both as producers and more recently as users. So I'm going to show a clip from a movie from 2005, which seems kind of old now, but here it is. So let's hope the sound works. Okay. Oh, wait.
You know what New York is?
How?
I saw you make a spinach dip in a loaf of sourdough bread once.
You know how I know that you're gay? You have a rainbow bumper sticker on your car that says, I love it when balls are in my face.
That's gay. Ah, damn it. I'm ripping your head off right now. It's off, and now I'm throwing it at your body. Fuck you! Oh.
You guys, she's picking me up in an hour.
Oh, drag, dude. Wait, she's picking you up from here?
Yeah.
That's fucked up, man.
Why?
Why? Seriously. I mean, look at this place, man. You gotta see this through the eyes of a woman, you know? What is she gonna think when she comes in here? Oh, look, he's got a billion toys.
So what?
And more video games than a teenaged Asian kid.
Okay, so you can see by the way I cut that what I'm trying to get out here. So in 2006, the concept of Asians as idealized game and media consumers, maybe fetishistic, kind of juvenile, stuck in a kind of perpetual effeminate state of consumption and overinvestment is really apparent here. Does anybody recognize the game that they're playing in the beginning of that clip?
Mortal Kombat?
Yeah. So, interestingly, Asian youth, especially boys, are depicted as consumers, but the idea of Asia as a producer of some of these media, which are very homosocial, you can see in this clip, right, is how men relate to each other in America, really isn't there yet. However, I want to contrast it with this, which is, it's a 2010 Banksy produced couch gag for The Simpsons. So I don't know if you're Simpsons fans anymore, but Banksy was invited to produce what they call a couch gag. It's the introductory bit to The Simpsons. And sometimes The Simpsons is very transgressive and they can be really kind of self-critical. It was amazing that this was allowed to air because it was extremely critical of the production culture of The Simpsons. But I'll just screen it and you can see what you think.
No!
Okay, so in this relatively brief amount of time, you can see that Asians are being re-envisioned as the people who work while we play, producing the media and the entertainment that so absorbs our attention, occupying literally a subterranean, invisible space where media and its images are produced beneath our feet and beneath our notice. Asians as uncreative, immiserated, kind of headless horde media workers caught up in a never-ending grind of production is really what this is parodying. I don't think it's saying this is the reality, it's parodying that idea. And my paper is going to be about this new Orientalism representation of Asian game players and workers. And obviously I'm going to critique it because these are both Orientalist images, obviously. In recent years, the despised figure of the gold farmer, Chinese gold farmer, and as Bonnie says, the gold farmers have become such a kind of meme in and of themselves that you are often asked, so you're studying gold farmers because you're going to China, regardless of the millions of Chinese who do not farm gold. The gold farmer, or player who sells virtual property and avatars earned in-game for real money, has become identified with China and Chinese players. In The Labor of Fun, Nick Yee writes, quote, "Video games are blurring the boundary between work and play very rapidly. Though every player has to work or engage in effortful and in-practice behavior in order to play or enjoy games, there are some for whom gaming is more work than others. For example, as Yee writes, there are companies such as IGE whose business model revolves around accumulating and selling virtual currency or gold." And here's a screenshot of a company that does this, or rather an advertisement in the game of World of Warcraft for a company that does this called MMOP.com. The employees of these companies play games for 12-hour shifts in order to earn virtual goods within them, which are then resold to other players. As Bonnie has written about elsewhere as well, much of this has been automated. And so it's botting or account stealing. I've had my account stolen. And so I have sold gold and I have bought it in World of Warcraft. My avatar was stolen and then used to sell gold to other players. So I had the interesting experience of being on both ends of this trade. The majority of this new form of digital production occurs in Asia, specifically China. Gold farmers were a mysterious and almost mythical group until 2005, when a surge of information about them, most of it through journalists, became available in the popular press. These players or gold farmers are really workers in the game. They are poorly paid, semi-illegal laborers who are unable to mingle or socialize with leisure players due to language differences, racial prejudice, and lack of time for play rather than work. In addition, they are routinely victimized by other players who believe they are ruining the game by providing leisure players with the ability to buy their accomplishments and items instead of earning them themselves. Journalist Julian DeBell writes quite sympathetically about the gold farmers, noting that while players complain vocally about the way gold farming and selling has ruined the economy, quote, "as a matter of everyday practice, it is the farmers who catch it in the face. In homemade World of Warcraft video clips that circulate on YouTube or game trailers with titles like Chinese gold farmers must die and Chinese farmer extermination, players document their farmer killing expeditions through that same timber maw-ridden patch of WoW in which Min does his farming, a place so popular with farmers that Western players sometimes call it Chinatown." So unlike the Chinatown in GTA, which looks like the real Chinatown and is mapped kind of literally on an actual physical space, instead, a fictional space is called Chinatown because it's a place where players who are, profiled as gold farmers and are killed tend to locate. Constance Steinkuhler's analysis of Lineage 2, a Korean MMO, uncovered some of the ways in which the condemnation of virtual currency buying is far exceeded by visceral hatred of gold sellers or farmers, which becomes a racialized hatred of Chinese players. Since many, but not all, gold farmers are Chinese, there's a really strong anti-Asian flavor to many of the player protests against Chinese gold farmers. As Steinkuhler notes, this has given rise to polls online querying players on North American servers. Is it okay to hate Chinese players? 32% of players said yes. The majority, 39%, replied, "I don't hate China, just what they stand for," in Lineage 2. And 10% checked, "I am Chinese and you should mind yourself, you racist pig." That's quoting from her. Though she notes calling someone Chinese is a general insult that seems aimed more at one's style of play than one's real-world ethnicity, the construction of Chinese identity in MMOs as abject, undesirable, socially contaminated, as we saw in the movie yesterday, War of Internet Addiction, the Chinese players in that movie know that they are stigmatized in foreign servers, Taiwanese servers, that they're referred to as locusts, as mainland people, unwanted, racializes the culture of online games and also ethnicizes it, obviously. A culture that scholars such as Ted Casanova have claimed are unique and valuable because they are exempt from the real world problems like racism, sexism, and looksism. So this notion that online games are attractive because they don't have those problems is really, when you look at this example, not at all the case, right? People are very much bringing in their own concepts of who's a desirable player and who's an abject worker, right? Who's a consumer and who is a producer. Though games are interesting for media scholars and for a lot of people, obviously, because the line between consumption and production really blurs. And so with the Simpsons episode, you can see that there is this notion of the Asian producer of media as being the kind of substrate upon which creative labor rests, right? That underneath everything you see on a screen, there's somebody putting together your iPhone, painfully making these, very chemically toxic cells for television shows. But that, in fact, is not the way The Simpsons is made, right? People sit in front of computers just like we do, and they make it on the computer. There isn't this laborious, artisanal, pre-modern, almost pre-industrial immiseration of the worker. And so this is a new kind of Orientalism, I would claim, one which envisions Asians as the raw material for digital media or digital culture, as well as its hyper-consumers, right? As well as the people who are overly invested, addicted, hyper-affected by new media and by digital games in particular. So scholar T.L. Taylor notes that WoW and other MMOs are distinguished by their enormous potential in a fairly divisive world. And the fact that people play with each other across regions and often countries often, however, results in ethnic and racial chauvinism. As she writes, quote, "As a tag, the conflation of Chinese with Gold Farmer has seemed to come all too easy and now transcends any particular game." So that this is not just about WoW, obviously, Diablo 2 and other games as well. Robert Brookie expands upon this claim. In his analysis of U.S. gaming blogs, he discovered, quote, overt racist attitudes towards Chinese gold farmers. Most importantly, quote, that some players who harbor negative feelings towards Chinese farmers do not believe that these feelings denote racial discrimination. So again, I don't hate Chinese, just what they stand for in the game, as if this distinction were extremely important. It is like saying, I don't hate Chinese, I just hate Chinese immigrants, right? As if to separate. No, I'm not kidding at all. Right? I think it's kind of a similar thing, right? I don't hate the people, I hate the people and why they are here, right? There's the distinction. Thus, though it is the case that players can't see each other's bodies while playing, specific forms of gaming activity and labor, such as selling in-game currency, as well as specific styles of play, as Bonnie was saying, not talking to people, doing the same thing over and over again, have become racialized and identified as Chinese, producing new forms of networked, or what I'm calling microaggression. As one Chinese player stated in a videotaped interview, this is a gold farmer, when we first heard of the term Chinese farmer, referring to the kind of job we did, we were very sensitive about it. We were uncomfortable with this term and unable to speak of it. Microaggression or microracism in virtual worlds still engenders shame, just as do other forms of mediated racism. Well, sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva writes, quote, the new colorblind racism, symptomatic of neoliberal cultural politics in the U.S., has driven most overt expressions of racism underground, at least offline. You won't hear people saying this in a classroom, but you will definitely see them saying it on an online forum. These tensions and racial resentments emerge in new forms as microaggressions. So what he means are things like not being able to talk about race, right, without stammering or misspeaking. Some people he interviewed literally weren't able to talk about it. They became so anxious about it. So what he means by microaggressions are small and often private expressions of racism, because public expressions of racism have become so socially censured, which is to say racism has been driven underground somewhat, but it's in full flower on the internet. Right? You could say that's what the internet is. It is, in fact, that substrate or that underground where things come out. Online gaming is not only a key industry that links the US/Europe and East Asia, it is a platform as well for anti-Chinese racial microaggression and other forms of symbolic violence. In the War of Internet Addiction, references to the unwanted migration of Chinese players from their imaginary homeland, or CWOW, to Taiwanese and US European servers where they are stigmatized as mainland locus, echoes discourses around Chinese players as unwanted migrants across terrestrial borders as well. Though these players are fleeing poor service provision from WoW licensees NetEase and the Nine and are coming to play, not necessarily to work, right? Maybe to work, but mostly not to work, their reputation as gold farmers precedes them, which is truly a form of virtual Orientalism. The hatred of Chinese players by many Western World of Warcraft players takes graphical, textual, and social forms that both gestures backwards to an anti-immigrant xenophobic past, which Nikki has written about, right? Anxieties about Asians taking jobs that others would like or ruining economies specifically. And I'm thinking about the Page Act, right? Why Chinese couldn't bring their women or wives into the country, it might make them stay, right? And then they would ruin the economy even more by having families and having them work for lower than minimum wage. And gestures forward as well into current cultural anxieties around China's economic ascendancy and possibly cultural ascendancy. So there's xenophobia behind us and in front of us, right? It's in both positions. Gold farmers, or as I call them, Chinese worker players, are stereotyped and to some extent romanticized as artisanal, grubby, proletarian, pre-industrial, living in dorms. And Bonnie's essay had a really strong effect on me because I saw this was almost like the Simpsons couch gag, right? It was this idea of the Chinese as so hopelessly backward, right? Oh, nothing but raw material for some kind of industry with no agency, no creativity, no technological savvy, which is absolutely wrong. I mean, it totally flies in the face of what people are doing in games that is genuinely creative, innovative, technologically sophisticated, Chinese among them. So this is the new Orientalism, as I said, hordes of digital migrants without agency, hidden, anonymous, as I said, the waste product in some respect of the digital industries. In a book called Korea's Online Gaming Empire, Dal Young-jin asserts that professional video game players in Korea, esports celebrities, are knowledge-based new media workers, not just consumers. And he has a point, for sure. I mean, people do support themselves and make a lot of money as professional game players, playing things like Counter-Strike and StarCraft, obviously. So what kinds of cultural workers are game players? Not just professional game players, but all game players. Obviously, modders are doing labor. They're making games, sometimes for money, sometimes not. Professional game players are obviously workers as well. They are paid for what they do. But gold farmers are too. And what's more, they have an expressive culture, which is, I think, more interesting than people had thought. Gold farming is more than repetitive, somewhat mindless, addictive labor. Instead, it involves a kind of creative work that involves programming, project management, and above all, sales. Gold farmers may be immiserated, an image lampooned by the Banksy clip, but the industry is certainly more complex than it has been portrayed and is in constant flux. WoW worker players are both oppressed workers indeed, stuck doing some of the most uncreative parts of a fundamentally pleasurable and creative game, the grind, killing the same thing over and over again, as well as innovators and producers of their own mediated expressive cultures in-game. Virtual world games are interesting to scholars because they are labs that demonstrate user creativity in a playful but constrained environment. So people love to look at games to see how players negotiate constraint, right? How they can break the game, how they can find ways to make the game work differently for them. The ingenuity of players has led them to create new forms of communication, such as leet speak, using keyboard characters like punctuation to communicate, in order to circumvent constraints over who can type what to who. Now that gold farmers have automated the production process for gold, the selling process has become a greater focus. Players are far more likely to encounter a gold seller than a gold producer in line at this point, I can say. Because WoW, unlike Second Life and other virtual world games, doesn't let users create objects in games, game advertising is a challenge. you really can't make new objects in World of Warcraft. It's really hard to create persistent artifacts in World of Warcraft that could serve as games. Chat is ephemeral, but making what we would consider advertisements is pretty hard. So hence body spam, which is not a term I made up. It's a term that players use to describe this practice. So here's an example of a part of World of Warcraft where gold farmers have killed themselves or been killed by others to spell out the name of their company. Here is another screenshot of the same. And these are almost always female avatars, and all of the same kind, a level 1 female orc, say, which they make several of and then kill or, commit suicide basically to make these images. And I found a video that shows the process of how this is done. Sometimes it's done by having people fall from a really great height in a particular body position so that they land so their body is shaped in a particular way and they die immediately because if a level 1 character can't withstand that kind of impact. Or sometimes people's avatars are killed by other players while they're standing in a particular way so they fall in a particular way. So this is immensely creative, right? Obviously the result of a lot of trial and error. The practice of body spamming invokes Orlando Patterson's notion of social death, a concept foundational to critical race studies. Literally, death occurs early and often in most video games. It's a fact of life. And is purely a symbolic act. It is social in the sense that it affects interaction with other players, but is in no way a biological or literal form of death. Yet as media artifacts such as the War of Internet Addiction, as well as scholarship like Ted Cashanova's influential Synthetic Worlds asserts, virtual world games are sites of real social exchange and the production of social identities that matter, both economically and culturally. To suffer social death is to exist in a state of bare life, as Giorgio Agamben would describe it. Slaves, for example, did not own their own bodies and were denied families and histories. They had suffered social death. What they had was life, but nothing but life. In WoW, the body or the avatar is the only thing that one can control. It becomes an element in a form of kinetic writing made up of worker corpses, a writing with the body that expresses a message about the working body's reality as disposable and replaceable resource. Body spam is both an impressively creative act, one that has caused Western players to marvel and thus sometimes to buy. So these continue because they are effective forms of advertising. People do follow these links, right? And what's more, they're interesting. People are standing there watching this. And there are now more and more clips of people watching the process because they're just so interested in it. It's so cool. So body spam is an act which has caused Western players to marvel and thus to buy, as well as a literalization of the immiserated worker's economic situation, unable to afford your own body. And I'll end by saying that these invoke images of Chinese digital worker suicides at Foxconn, where over a dozen workers have thrown themselves off of dorm high-rise windows, causing the company to put up nets. And Foxconn is where the iPad and many game consoles, including the Xbox controller, are made. And so this notion of Chinese worker suicides as a form of expressive practice, but also as a practice in the world, I think, is something to think about. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Petrus Liu. He's an assistant professor of comparative literature at Cornell University. He's published articles on martial arts literature, queer Marxism in Taiwan, the problem of narrative and self-making in the modern romance novel, translations of post-socialist literary criticism, the rural question in China, third worldism, new cinema, Chinese science fiction, inter-Asian feminism, and late Qing philosophy of gender. He's recently published a co-edited volume, Beyond the Straits, Transnationalism and Queer Chinese Politics, and has a book titled Stateless Subjects, Chinese Martial Arts Literature and Post-Colonial History, forthcoming from Cornell University.
Thank you, Irene. Yeah. Hello.
So they seem to stay about 6 inches away from me, so we don't
Okay.
need to be so close.
Okay, is that good? All right. Hi. Thank you very much. My talk today is going to be about a different video game, Sid Meier's Civilization series, and I'm just going to show you the website and a couple of images from the site to give people who haven't played the game an idea of what it's about. Now, since its release, the release of the original version of the game in 1991, Sid Meier's Civilization series has been the most successful turn-based PC game in history. The game has enjoyed an unprecedentedly long kind of shelf life among PC games, which typically has, the shelf life of C products, having the shelf life of about 5 to 6 months. And the game has seen 5 official incarnations or installments. The latest incarnation of the game was released last year by Firaxis. There have also been numerous spin-offs, such as Colonization, Call to Power, and Free Civ and CVO, and adaptations for gaming consoles and board games. The game has also won several prestigious awards and prizes, including the Origins Award, and a lot of these awards identify the game as one of the most influential games of all times. Now, the basic game design of Civilization asks the player to choose a civilization such as Egypt, China, America, or France, and lead its people from the dawn of time to the age of atomic bombs, from the invention of the wheel to the race for spaceships. The tagline for the product describes the gaming experience as an opportunity for players to build, to quote, build an empire to stand the test of time and to match wits against history's most cunning leaders, end quote. The strategy side of the game comes from the fact that the different civilizations a player must choose have different characteristics and advantages and disadvantages, such as bonuses in resource gathering speed, technology research, army size, different forms of government, war-making capabilities, political stability, trade, and cultural influences. Players must choose between these different bonuses and strategies and utilize them to their advantage. Players must also manage a number of tasks and events in the game, such as population growth, city infrastructure, natural disasters, building constructions, terrain improvements, natural resources, technologies, and war and peace with other civilizations. Sid Meier's Civilization is a fun and multifaceted strategy game, and it is easy to understand its appeal. The success of the game and the kind of historical record it has made in gaming history, however, is not simply reflective of the values and taste of a small isolated gaming community or designers. Rather, I would argue that the broad appeal of the game Civilization is predicated on the ideological strength of the American myth of progress. Furthermore, the cultural semiotics of the game is intimately tied to the shifting geopolitical relations between America and China, where China figures not so much as a country, but rather China stands as a conceptual dilemma for this particular type of American ideology of progress, and it signifies a contradiction in terms. In the language of critical theory, we might call this China, or the epistemic position occupied by China in the American sociological imagination, as a lacuna, as a contradiction in terms. as a lacuna, China is full of paradoxes, and it is at once a hopelessly backward civilization and a sign of modern wonders and progress. It stands as a backward civilization mired in tradition, dictatorship, disrespect for human rights, overpopulation, ethnic and racial problems, and a gigantic territory. China, in this American perception or in the representation of the game, is also a rising political and military superpower marked by accelerated economic development and efficiency, a superpower that is armed with tradition, dictatorship, disrespect for human rights, overpopulation, ethnic and racial diversity, and a gigantic territory. What was once thought to be the impediment to China's path to modernity 20 years ago is today also precisely the sign of its modernity or even post-modernity. While sociologists and political scientists a decade ago point to China and India's population as evidence of their backwardness or third world status, today people, sometimes the same people, point to China and India's population as evidence of their economic growth. And they're citing the same numbers to characterize China as a fantastic business opportunity. We hear people ask questions like, if you can sell a bottle of Coca-Cola to every person in China, how much money would you make? The two seemingly contradictory perceptions of China as a miracle economy and as backwater hick swamp, as model minority and as yellow peril, are not historically successive readings of the same country, but rather they're the two sides of the same coin that are co-constitutive. And in this presentation today, I would like to explore some of these contradictions and in the representation or Orientalism of the game, and also think about how these contradictions inform and shape the game design and its community. By analyzing this piece of popular culture, this particular cultural artifact this way, I hope to shed some light on the complicated relationship between American liberal ideology and the story called The Rise of China. Here I'm just gonna show you a couple of images from their website. This is actually from Civ 5, not the original version of Civ. Here you can see how they juxtapose, all the different civilizations. Some are mythologized, and some are represented in their historical forms, and or rendered by what is most iconic and memorable about that culture. We see the modernity of Germany, and as it's flexing its muscles, and some of the leaders and monuments. It's very clear what each symbol and each culture refers to. Now, the interesting thing about the latest version of the game is that it is the image of China, which is here represented by an animated figure of Wu Zetian, and she looks attractive, and she speaks in Chinese, and she's saying basically in the dialogue here that if you don't invade me, I'm not going to invade you. And in previous versions of the game, the leader of China has always been Mao Zedong, and in one version it was actually represented by Qin Shi Huang, and this is the first time that China is represented by Wu Zetian, or Wu Zhao, as she is known in some history books. Now, the first contradiction we would notice in the game design is that there is a general confusion or conflation between nation and civilization. A typical game offers 18 pre-designed civilizations to choose from, which would always include America, China, India, England, Germany, France, Russia, Egypt, Rome, and Greece. The other ones are variable. The selection of playable civilizations reflects an obviously Eurocentric bias, which is best summarized by the thesis that all history is contemporary history. That is, only the powerful modern nations that participated in the great wars of the 20th century are constructed as civilizations. And as civilizations, Germany, England, and America have histories that start out from 4000 BCE instead of the 18th century. And instead of being treated as nation states derived from earlier historical cultures, America, England, Germany are said to be civilizations that have the same kind of linguistic and racial homogeneity as Egypt, China, Rome, Greece did or do, hypothetically. The conflation of civilization and nation states becomes a market problem when it comes to the representation of China. The fact that the territory under the modern jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China was historically divided does not actually interest the game designers very much. Whereas European nations and their history are rendered with great detail, high levels of fine distinctions, China is simply a conglomerate of large and confused ideas. The overrepresentation of European nations presents a technical problem for game balance. When the game is played on a real-world map, all of the European civilization will be clumped together on a very small continent, and their growth checked by the scarcity of resources, lack of expansion space, and constant threat of external military competition. At the same time, China, left unchecked, standing alone by itself in the Far East, will quickly seize all the nearby resources and see its territory expand exponentially. There seems to be no easy solution, no easy way to balance between the overcrowded European nations who were made the subject of true history and a large standalone and free expanding overpowered China, about which the game designers and the players remain quite ignorant. In fact, the game designers have not yet been able to come up with a game mechanic that would naturally result in or produce some kind of economic backwardness for China without giving any kind of handicap to the civilization. All playable civilizations start out in the same year, that is, 4000 BCE, and all of them will naturally utilize nearby resources to develop technology. So despite the Eurocentric vision of the game, the designers have not been able to come up with an in-game strategy or mechanic that will naturally lead to a world dominated by European powers, or a mechanic that is capable of explaining the historical genesis of European dominance as we know it. A partial solution to the problem is to install a crude version of the guns, gems, and steel type of geographical determinism theory, that is, by linking the developmental capacity or potential of a civilization to the type of geographical terrain that is available to that civilization, the kind of geographical terrain that a particular civilization finds itself on. Indeed, this has been the game designer's approach to Africa and South America. Neither continent is represented or populated by a diversity of civilizations. There's a great degree of inconsistency when it comes to the question of who represents the two continents. Africa is usually represented by the Zulus in most versions of the game, in addition to Egypt. And in some versions of the game, they also include civilizations such as Carthage, Ethiopia, or Songhai. And as for South America and North America, in some versions we have the Aztec and Maya and Inca, and in some versions of the game, there's a civilization simply called the Native Americans. In any case, a general lack of interest in the specificity and complexity of historical cultures outside of North America result in problems for game balance, which is corrected by the theory of geographical determinism, because the game designers simply make Africa and South America unproductive terrains that are either basically consisting of unproductive or uninhabitable desert tiles or swamp tiles. To prevent these civilizations from advancing too quickly in technology, to prevent the embarrassing scenario of having the Zulus be the first one to discover steam power and the railroad while Europe is still researching the alphabet and ironworking. The overrepresentation and concentration of individual European civilizations is corrected by an enlarged map of Europe and an abundance of natural resources in Europe, but the game designer have trouble making the same strategy work for China, and turning China into a stunted civilization and somehow explaining the desirability of colonizing China at the same time. Plenty more civilizations in East Asia, or differentiating the internal civilizations in East Asia that make up what is called China today, is not an acceptable solution for the game designers, since this move would obscure the focus of the game and imply that non-European civilizations might be the actual agents and actors of history. Turning the continent of Asia into unproductive jungles and deserts is not an acceptable solution either, since doing so not only grossly contradicts the historical flavor of the game, but decreases the price and profitability of colonizing Asia, which is something that is usually undertaken by the European powers, in the game later on, as they come out to conquer China and seize control of its riches. There is no story to tell about how China starts out as a weakened country, mired in feudalism and superstition, and somehow the sleeping dragon comes to understand the importance of science and democracy after rude awakening by Western invaders, and rapidly industrializes itself into a major competition in the global race to spaceship, but somehow loses that race by an inch of hair, because the Western civilizations also managed to build the Manhattan Project and captures the Chinese capital after nuking it. Sadly for the designers, they have not yet found a way to implement a game mechanic that would naturally produce this kind of history, or this kind of dynamic rise and fall of civilizations and empires. So what solution did they come up with in the end? One word: communism. In many versions of the game, China is controlled by an AI, and when it is controlled by an AI, it is programmed to adopt communism at some point, which will cause increased pollution, domestic unhappiness, and a drop in scientific output. but also accelerated military production and the ability to override domestic oversight and of the people and quell dissension from pacifist quarters and suspend civil liberties in times of war, making it easier to forego diplomacy in favor of a military path to victory. Now, in world systems theory today, the economic and political dominance of Europe is typically explained as a result of the internal military as a result of the intensity of internal military and economic competition from within Europe, while the backwardness or stagnancy of China is seen as a result of the lack of external threat. The cliche we hear in world system theory is that up until the 17th century, China enjoyed a high degree of economic stability and scientific growth, despite its lack of Christianity, being the first civilization to discover the secrets of gunpowder, but limiting its use to entertainment and ceremonial purposes, because there was no military application of gunpowder for a country that didn't really have any threatening neighbors. In the 16th and 17th century Europe, on the contrary, overpopulation and a curiosity about the rest of the world, unlike the celestial kingdom, that is an open-minded outlook on the world led to the discovery of the New World, which subsequently intensified internal intra-imperialist competition for resources among the European powers, and this competition led to a greater need for trade, diplomacy, and scientific innovations, which produced finally the English capitalism or industrialism, and hence the great divergence between China and Europe. At the same time, suffering from delusions about their cosmological centeredness and economic self-sufficiency, the people of the Middle Kingdom became mired in obsolete technology and antiquarian customs that could not solve modern problems, and fell behind Europe. Failing to open up to the West like Japan did, China became a victim of its own stubbornness. According to this view, the tragic fate China suffered in modern times, that is, the history of unequal treaties, opium trade, the imposition of extraterritoriality, concessions, uprisings, and the Boxers' invasion, and so on. In other words, China's semi-coloniality was due to its own unwillingness to trade with the West and learn from their superior values, which is a mistake that China made again after the Communist Revolution began to delink itself from the world economy and retreat into the sphere of self, or the rhetoric of self-sufficiency, retreat further back into economic and political isolation. Here again, we see a reproduction of the stereotypical image of China as an isolationist country who fell behind in the world because they refused to buy things from the West. Whether it is a China behind the Great Walls or a China behind the Iron Curtain, the hermit kingdom shrouded in socialist experiments or Oriental mysticism, or the celestial kingdom suffering from a delusional heliocentrism, the image of China we get is not really about China at all, but about the moral right of the West to purchase and trade and to expand its trade work with East Asia and to accumulate a colonial wealth, discipline other kings and queens, and to assert the universal validity of Western liberal values. In conventional social theory, the so-called Great Divergence between China and Europe is the result of many factors other than trade. We have heard stories about the discovery and use of coal as a fuel resource, the efficiency of market and state intervention, luxury consumption, property rights, the discovery of the New World and its strategic relevance, and above all, the development of European capitalism. The story of European capitalism is furthermore narrated with an implicit or explicit preference for Christianity, and the success of capitalism is therefore said to be partially due to a Protestant working ethic. Capitalism did not originate in the non-European world, which fell behind after the Great Divergence because they worshipped other gods, and apparently the gods they worshipped didn't tell them to work very hard. And the lack of capitalism outside of Europe is in turn explained. The lack of capitalism outside of Europe in turn explained the backwardness of the peripheral countries' military and economic prowess when the European nations came to colonize them. All of these ideas are well represented by the gameplay experience of Sid Meier's Civilizations, although with a different degree of emphasis and a high degree of inconsistency. The key point, though, is that historical progress is naturalized as and equated with the development of capitalism in both social theory and in terms of the game's internal logic and its representation. And this kind of representation explains the genesis of capitalism and the role it plays in facilitating historical progress as some kind of, in the form of a liberal ideology that presumes the naturalness of free trade. If we compare world system theory to the logic and mechanics of Sid Meier's Civilizations, the real roots of world system theory in liberalism becomes shockingly clear. Like many other popular strategy games, including the original Warcraft, StarCraft, and the Age of Empire, Civilization is a resource management game. In Civilization, each terrain tile produces one or more resources a player may gather to empower his or her civilization, and mainly there are three types: food, trade, and production. A production resource is usually symbolized by timber or ore. Much of gameplay involves decisions a player must make about city placement. That is, should my city be founded on a grassland for for quick population growth, or should it be near a mountain tile so that I can pump out a tank every other turn in late game, or should it be on a coastal tile so that I can generate additional trade points and funnel these trade points into quick scientific research, and so on and so forth. The mechanism by which civilizations evolve in the game is, needless to say, highly unrealistic. What is interesting, though, is that labor is never considered to be a resource in the game, and it is never represented. Rather, the speed at which a civilization constructs buildings, wonders, and military units or scientific research is determined by the number of appropriate natural terrain tiles within its radius. Trade is a resource that is produced by these terrain tiles, just like mountains and hills produce timber and ores for military and production purposes. Coastal water tiles produce 3 trade points, rivers 1, and any terrain on which you have built a road produce 1 as well. What exactly is at stake ideologically, we should think, in a game that represents trade as something materially, as something you can gather and collect and even produce materially on the same kind of analogical plane to ores and timber. Indeed, the most significant problem posed by the game's representation of the economic process is the exclusion of labor as a resource. While liberal thinkers think of capital as self-generating value, Marxist critics understand the difference between redistribution and production. Human labor, as Marx has taught us, is the only activity, really, that produces commodities and other useful articles in society, where when a person trades one commodity for another, the act of trading does not actually generate or create more use values for society. It simply redistributes the claims to different commodities that a person may have. So when you put money in the bank and you start to generate revenues or interests, there's an illusion that money becomes self-generating capital, and then that money is self-begetting value. But what it really does is it redistributes different social actors' claims to an existing field of available commodities without changing the amount of commodities available to that society. Trade neither creates nor increases the value of aggregate commodities available for society. It takes a human being and his or her labor to produce a commodity or any kind of article of utility. The fact that the game Civilizations represents trade as a source of scientific and economic progress is simply perverse. And the fact that it represents trade as a thing, as an objectified thing you can gather, is even more so. It is in this distorted representation of trade and the occlusion of labor that the game betrays its real roots in American liberal free trade, laissez-faire capitalist ideology. And by identifying and dissecting this ideological outlook, we come to a better understanding of the peculiar ways in which China is represented in the game as well. Civilization is a game about historical progress, about how and why we use trade to advance human knowledge. Again, the technological tree is blatantly and hopelessly Eurocentric. Every civilization must discover the secrets of the alphabet before they can develop a rating system, for example, and civilizations have to first learn polytheism in order to advance to monotheism, which is superior. And then later on, monotheism is going to enable feudalism, which leads to banking and the university and scientific reason and lots of important technologies in the medieval and early modern times. As I have already pointed out, in the game, science is generated by trade, and the more trade you generate, the faster you can produce science and advance down the technology tree, and also produce more powerful buildings, military units, and wonders of the world. In connecting trade to historical progress, the game celebrates and glorifies free trade ideology and enforces that ideology by introducing another feature called government in Civilization. Now, in the game, players can switch between a number of governments after discovering the appropriate technology associated with that form of government. Under democracy, you can trade. Your trade and scientific progress will double, but you will not be able to wage war against another civilization. Under communism and fascism, you get a production boost and you can produce more threatening military units and spies, but your trade and science output will suffer. What is reflected in this popular game, I think, is far from a trivial cultural stereotype. Rather, what we see is a distinctive ideology rooted in the Cold War period that raises an important question about human understandings of historical progress and the question of how to situate China in the large scheme of things. I would like to conclude my presentation by turning briefly to two different texts on the question of history. One much more recent than the other. The first one is Depeche Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, and the second one is Louis Althusser's Reading Capital. In Chakrabarty's influential work, Provincializing Europe, he makes a very strong argument for and against Marx's conception of history. While employing many tools he inherited from Marx's historical materialism and acknowledging these intellectual debts, Chakrabarty nevertheless singles out Marx and Marxism as the main culprit for the emotional complex the peoples of the Third World develop with modernization theory. It is because Marx first introduced a vision of history as the linear and successive development of modes of production that men and women in locations like India became obsessed with the idea of modernity, and that that is why they felt that they must emulate the European model of progress, to which they felt inadequate by comparison. And then they develop an obsession with the very idea of modernity, which is all Marx's fault, according to Chakrabarty's observation. The romantic story about the transition, the story of the transition from feudalism to capitalism became an ideal for all third world countries. And this particular story recounted by Marx, which is really simply a national history of the development of English capitalism, gave rise to development of economics and modernization theory in the 20th century, and the modernization theory derived from Marxist historicism became the cornerstone of belief for not just the defenders of laissez-faire capitalism and the posse of the IMF, but also for the recipients of economic aid packages in the third world and their governments and their intellectual elites. To correct this trend, Chakrabarty proposes a dualistic conception of history that he calls History 1 and History 2. While History 1 is the singular and assimilative logic of capital, History 2 refers to the narratives and forms of history that do not belong to capital's life process. These things that do not contribute to the reproduction of capital despite the global totality of capitalist development. History 2, which is always in excess of the workings of capital, is inhabited and embodied in and experienced in mythical times and life worlds, full of irreducibly heterogeneous life practices that are capable of interrupting and punctuating the logic of capital as a closed circuit. We can contrast this interpretation to one offered by an earlier work, Althusser's Reading Capital, which uncannily takes up the same question of heterogeneity and historical time, provoked by Chakrabarty's book, and also by the representation of China in Meier's Civilization. But Althusser comes to exactly the opposite conclusion on these questions. Now, the question of what drives history forward has been central to critical theory and philosophy since the 18th century. In his reinterpretation of Marxism as a living form of dialectical criticism instead of a teleological historicism, Althusser performs a symptomatic reading of Marxist economic text in order to show that that Marxism is not a historicism after all, as critics like Chakrabarty have claimed later on, or would claim years later. Prior to Althusser, most critics understand materialism to be a doctrine that explains the workings of history in terms of an anthropology of needs. The needs for shelter, food, procreation, and self-preservation define every human organization, but the manners in which men and women satisfy these needs and appropriate the fruits of nature differs from society to society, and the organization of their labor and the distribution of their products then define their historical relation to their relation to history. And that relationship is termed mode of production. Historical materialism becomes a powerful analysis of the specific character of each mode of production and each form of political economy or social organization. The doctrine of historical materialism, the idea that historical change ought to be explained by the relation between the anthropology of needs and the changing conditions of human laboring activities, however, creates the impression that Marxism is a version of teleological history, even a theodicy or political Darwinism, according to which one mode of production will inevitably supersede another in a linear, one-directional movement, and simply as the result of the maturation of objective external economic conditions. Worse still, this reading of Marxism as historicism or stagist theory presupposes the cultural normativity, analytical centrality, and historical primacy of the Western European experience. Marx's theorization of the world and many phenomena he describes by that phrase, world historical, throughout his writings, simply presumes the primacy of the development of English industrial capitalism. I'm going to skip parts of this analysis and just conclude by saying that Althusser points out that Marxist Marxism, or Marxist conception of history, is founded on the analytical specificity of the CMC scheme, which is not based on the anthropology of needs as we see in a game like Civilization. And he insists on the difference between Marx the historian and Hegel the historian, where Hegel's conception of history is metaphysical, Marx's conception of history is dialectical, and there's an important difference there that can actually aid our understanding of the representation of historical progress in the game and other cultural artifacts of the 21st century. My reading of the game and the problem China poses for its representational scheme provides an entry point into a reconsideration of the question of historicism introduced by Althusser's and Chakrabarty's divergent works. Perhaps what is needed is a more nuanced definition of temporality, which is different from historicity and history. And this temporality refers to how human beings think, engage, relate to, and make sense of the flows of time in a highly mediated intersubjective context. It is my sense that game theory and the study of gaming culture is particularly productive towards the development of such a theory. And what insights can come out of this discussion about games and gaming culture in time and China, temporality, only time can tell. All right, thank you.
And the last paper in this panel will be given by Holin Lin, Professor of Sociology at National Taiwan University. Her major research interests are computer game culture, computer-mediated communication, the social dynamics of virtual communities, socioeconomic behaviors in online game worlds, and gender and information technology. She has written extensively on the social aspects of information technology with a recent focus on the social dynamics of in-game communities, game tip sharing behaviors, cash trades of in-game assets, norms and deviance, negotiation in MMORPGs, and gendered gaming experience in different physical spaces.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yesterday, the film showed us the first half of a story of virtual migration, and today my presentation will follow that story to the second part, what happened after they migrated to another world. This is a study I co-worked with Professor Transnational from National Jiao Tong University in Taiwan, who is also here today. We are currently witnessing two conflicting trends. The first is increasingly strong post-9/11 border controls, and the second is a growing volume of cross-border online interactions. One of the most popular channels for those interactions is online games. Online games are unique in creating ongoing world in which relatively stable groups of players living together on a daily basis for months or even years. The huge social spaces generated by online games are providing new channels for collective cross-border interactions with major and subtle implications for the physical world. One of the best examples is currently taking place in Asia, with Chinese World of Warcraft players migrating to Taiwan servers to live and play with Taiwanese players. For this study, we used data from 3 sources: articles posted on Taiwanese and Chinese game forums, interviews with Taiwanese WoW players, and our own ethnographic observations on Taiwan WoW servers for more than 4 years. Of course, the data inevitably reflect the feelings of Taiwanese players and favor their interpretations about shared experiences, and thus has a weaker representation of Chinese players' viewpoints. We would like to work some more on that aspect later. We summarize the migrant movement in this figure. Green arrows stand for Taiwanese players and red for Chinese WoW players. The width of the arrows stands for the relative scale of the immigration wave. Blizzard Entertainment released the first version of WoW in North America in November of 2004. Its Chinese carrier, the Knight, Jiucheng, released a simplified Chinese character version in April of 2005, and its Taiwanese carrier, Game First, Zhifandi, released a traditional Chinese character version in October of that same year for players in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. Due to this 6-month gap, a few Taiwanese players went to China servers to experience the game. Both companies released game content on the same schedule between October of 2005 and April of 2007. Most players simply used the servers in their own countries, but a small number of Chinese players paid tourist visits to Taiwan servers during that period. Okay. In January of 2007, Blizzard launched a major WoW expansion, the Burning Crusade, TBC. Game First in Taiwan made the adjustment and quickly released the TBC on Taiwan servers. However, primarily due to the content censorship, business competition, and publication control policies for imported games enforced by the Chinese government, the China servers were suffering from a series of delayed expansion launching problems. Some impatient Chinese players started migrating to Taiwan servers. We call this wave the TBC rush. Unfortunately, a large number of immigrants triggered server overloads, long log-on queues, sometimes 3 to 4 hours waiting time, and lags in gameplay. Many Taiwanese players blamed the invading Chinese for these inconveniences. GameFirst eventually responded to the overloading problem by increasing the number of Taiwan servers. When the Night released the mainland Chinese version of TBC in September of 2007, the large majority of migrant Chinese players immediately returned to their local servers, giving some Taiwan servers the appearance of ghost towns. Taiwanese players used locust plug to describe the visit. And the situation was getting worse in the long-delayed release of WoW's second expansion, The Wrath of the Lich King, which resulted in many Chinese players abandoning Chinese WoW servers in 2008. Chinese players migrated collectively in this WLK rush, with many players' guilds moving intact. By this time, the majority of Chinese players had given up hope for returning to China servers and decided to become the online resident aliens. They have also become a threatening majority on many Taiwan servers. As a result, frequent daily contacts now take place between residents of two countries whose official relationships has long been marked by limited contact and political tension. Individuals who still physically live in mainland China are spending large amounts of time interacting through a new form of telepresence and are leading new life in a foreign land called Taiwan server. Here are some of our primary findings. First, we observed that there are at least 3 types of political interactions going on in the game worlds. The first is using character IDs to express their sarcastic political opinions. We found many examples of this type, such as, was Abian wrong? Abian is the nickname of the former president in Taiwan, Chen Shui-bian. And Li Gang is my son. It is my understanding that GameFirst forbids the use of major political figures' names as IDs, such as former President Chen Shui-bian or current President Ma Ying-jeou. Therefore, players must use homophones when referring to them. Li Gang incident yesterday, also we heard a little bit of them. Li Gang incident refers to a hit-and-run car incident happened last year in Hebei, when the young drunken driver was surrounded by angry onlookers and forced him to step out of the car. Instead of showing remorse, he yelled out, "Go ahead and sue me. My father is Li Gang." So Li Gang is a deputy chief of the local security bureau. My father is Li Gang has since become one of the most popular catchphrases of mocking China's high-ranking officials' corruption and privilege. And also river crab and grass mud horse. Both are homophones mocking Chinese internet control policies. We used WoW's Armory database to check some of these names, and these are some examples of how popular these character IDs are. Each table shows all characters with such names across Taiwan server. This one is for Li Gang is my father. And these are river crab and grass mud horse. If nothing else, these names and comments stimulate curiosity on the part of players who have little understanding about political affairs on either side of Taiwan Strait. Since this type of political teasing comments target at domestic issues, they usually do not stimulate negative feelings among players of the other side. Unlike the first type, the second type of political display declare religious belief or national identity, sometimes in a provoking way. One popular ID is a highly sensitive term in China, 法轮功. here, 法轮功 and 法轮大法, 法轮大法好 and 法轮大法. Here are some examples. There are so many of them, since you can only have one character with that name in each server. So actually, it's pretty popular. We also observed exceptionally provocative character names, such as these ones. Here's a picture. Shows a hunter, who definitely is a Chinese player, as a hunter whose pet was a pig named Taiwan belongs to China. Yeah. This picture is given by one of our Taiwanese interviewees. He was very angry about that. Here are some examples from Taiwanese side, such as 专杀46, kill 426. 426 is the Taiwanese homophones for damn Chinese. These names tend to provoke strong emotions. They are more likely to be found during low-level game activities instead of organized raid and other high-level guild activities. Regardless, they are now a regular part of the landscape, noticeable by anyone who spent time playing on Taiwan WoW servers, injecting a strong real-world political sensibility into a fantasy game world. We found both overt nationalist confrontations and covert exchanges of viewpoints. For the former part, political confrontation on public channels represents another type of political interaction. These conflicts were particularly numerous and heated during the early stages of the WLK rush. Conflicts usually began with Taiwanese players openly complaining about the disregard that Chinese players showed for local game culture on public channels. Typical comments were, don't spam the public channel, or don't use simplified characters, or don't use pinyin acronyms, or sometimes Taiwanese players were accusing Chinese raid leaders of ninja looting. Here are some examples of scrambled words caused by unsuccessful display of simplified character on Taiwan server, and also some simplified characters and pinyin acronyms, those underlined. Chinese players usually responded with comments such as, don't Taiwanese players also use their own Mandarin phonetic symbols of Bopomofo, or don't paint everyone with the same brush. Sometimes this dispute elevated to crude exchanges such as chink pick, go back to China, or from Chinese side, we are here to colonize you. These quarrels sometimes lasted for hours and attracted hundreds of comments. Due to their profits from the large influx of Chinese players, Game First was not willing to let these political exchanges continue. In early last year, it posted an announcement on its WoW logon page that improper political speeches were no longer permitted on public channels, and that players who violated the new rule were in danger of having their account suspended. The announcement triggered protests by Taiwanese players about speech censorship, with some organizing a letter-writing campaign to Blizzard to express their disappointment, as shown here. But I only showed the first half of the letter. It was too long. There was a sharp after that, there was a sharp decline in the number of open conflicts on public channels. In comparison, we also witnessed covert exchanges of viewpoints. Political interaction in public channels are usually among strangers. Acquaintances can use other more private ways for communicating. For example, members-only guild channels, chat channels created by players for their own social networks, or a one-to-one private channel. Political topics are considered sensitive and sometimes to be avoided among group channels, especially when both Taiwanese and Chinese players were presented, since they can break relationship and hinder cooperation. However, as trust builds within a specific group or between individuals, players may feel comfortable bringing up political topics. We did find evidence of restrained yet honest exchanges of political opinions on one-to-one private channels. Several of our Taiwanese interviewees said that they had relatively close friendship with individual Chinese players who privately expressed curiosity and excitement about Taiwan's democratic system and election culture. Some were curious or surprised about how outside world thought of China. We found that these cross-state interactions in online game worlds are shaped by several structural factors. The first one is the segregation based on we-they differences. Residents of Chinese language-speaking areas are different in terms of linguistic dialect, use of the simplified or traditional Chinese characters, and other historical and cultural developments. All of these differences provides clear clues for identifying a WoW player's nationality and serves as a basis for segregation. Taiwanese players use Zhuyin, or Bopomofo, phonetic symbols, while Chinese use pinyin for transcribing Chinese characters. Taiwanese follow American gaming culture and use English acronyms. For example, DK for Death Knight, OOM for Out of Mana, while Chinese use pinyin acronyms. For example, FS 法师 for Mage, LR 猎人 for Hunter, and FM 附魔 for Enchanting. Taiwanese players believe that interactional courtesy is important, while Chinese players emphasize gaming efficiency. Almost all of our interviewees described Chinese players as focused on competition and more aggressive. When describing collective behaviors associated with leveling up, improving equipment, and conquering new bosses, one of our Taiwanese interviewees said, "It seems that their entire nation wants to get strong and feel that it must do so quickly." Having unpleasant contact experiences, some players use segregation strategies such as stating preferences for Taiwanese or Chinese players in guild recruitment. In this case, a Taiwanese guild recruitment, it actually stated, "Those interested, please type in password Moboge, 3 symbols of the Taiwanese phonetic systems, so as to make sure that the recruited players are Taiwanese." Here's another example of the recruiting raid party members. It specified that Taiwanese dialect would be used in raid voice channel. Rumors about how to block Chinese players also circulated among Taiwanese players. For example, there was a very commonly circulated story about Chinese players could be forced out of networks by typing the message, 法轮功 is great, 法轮大法好, on public channels. Since the Chinese government was sure to see it and respond by eliminating all Chinese players on that game map, we actually tested that theory personally and found it is not true. Okay. Another factor that shaped players' contact experience is the structural position in game architecture. It would be wrong to describe all Taiwanese players as having homogeneous attitude toward Chinese players. The core WoW activities of dungeons and raid require groups of players working together. Players with rich social networks can minimize their contact with undesirable outsiders while still meeting the collaborative requirements of the game. However, for players who do not have extensive network, they were forced to join parties consisting of unknown players. Collaboration generally ends when tasks are finished, which may not be long enough to promote mutual understanding, and yet in this randomly composed party settings, they were most likely to experience rudeness or ninja looting from stranger players. In fact, the most negative anti-Chinese attitudes were found among Taiwanese players who lack social network resources. In contrast, Taiwanese players who belong to those high-end guilds tend to have very different contact experience with Chinese players. Unlike the flat power structures of short-lived dungeons and raid parties, high-end guilds usually have clearly hierarchical structures, with managers at the top wielding great powers in recruiting and regulating members. Any Chinese players who are allowed to join these Taiwanese guilds are likely to obey guild rules and bend to the existing culture. As a result, it is easier for them to feel acceptance with Taiwanese players and to develop more open and positive relationships. A third factor is the effect of population ratios on collective dynamics. We found that the Taiwanese to Chinese player ratio plays a critical role in shaping gaming behaviors. Since Game First does not release the numbers of Chinese players in Taiwan, we could only present a rough picture here. In the first stage of WoW migration, Chinese players were small in number. They were very, very self-conscious about their language and behaviors and generally maintained a very low profile. In TBC Rush, although Chinese immigrants were large in number, they were still in the minority. This changed with the WOK Rush. We learned privately from a Game First manager that about half of its players at the time were mainland Chinese. During the TBC Rush, Taiwanese players developed a minority-majority relationship. Chinese players develop a majority relationship with Taiwanese players. Many immigrated to Taiwan servers in groups or guilds, thus bringing their own social networks and becoming visible. However, they still maintained relatively low profile in public, with some Chinese guild managers officially asking their members to fit in with local culture and to use traditional Chinese characters for communication. Some of our interviewees expressed strong appreciations for these efforts to blend in. When asked to compare Chinese players in the TBC Rush and in WOK Rush, they described the distinct differences, with the first being relatively polite guests and good playmates willing to respect a host culture. In contrast, they described the Chinese players of WOK Rush as annoying and lack of cultural literacy. Following the WOK Rush, players on both sides were fully aware that the number of Chinese players had grown immensely. This development allowed many Chinese players to view themselves as surrounded by fellow Chinese players, and therefore feel less of a need to blend in with the local culture. We heard one story where Taiwanese players protested the use of simplified characters. Chinese players arrogantly responded with the comments, "Oh, do we still have Taiwanese here?" The increasing use of simplified characters and pinyin acronyms gave many Taiwanese players the feeling that foreigners are everywhere and that they had lost their host status. A significant number chose to remain silent during public debates. Whether based on rational choices to keep games running smoothly or on the natural blending that has occurred following a long period of contact, both Chinese and Taiwanese game cultures have changed to produce a hybrid. One piece of evidence is the adoption of some forms of game jargon from the other side. Another concerns custom of looting etiquette in randomly composed dungeon parties. The system of rolling works as players who need an item, they should get first pick at it before those who want it for greed. In the past, the default option among Taiwanese players were greed, meaning I would like to have that piece of equipment if no one else wants it. However, the Chinese default is need, which has a higher priority. According to one interviewee, I no longer hit the greed button immediately after equipment is dropped. I waited to see what others choose. If you hit greed, I'll follow with the same. If you hit need for something you don't really need, I'll follow with need too. Last but not least, we witnessed new understanding through daily and long-term contact. We met young Taiwanese players with no international travel experience or opportunity to meet mainland Chinese who described their online personal experiences as helping them to form and modify their political views and attitude toward Chinese. In some cases, they explained how such real and personal contact experiences has reshaped political views they had adopted from their parents. Since real-world politics do not have a firm control over online game worlds, these spaces still function as a window to outside world. We found plenty of evidence indicating Chinese awareness of ever-present political control, but from time to time, we would notice players willing to express and discuss their opinions. We cannot be certain, but this may be the result of the idea that I am not on a China server, a sense that I am in a foreign land, a land that is out of the reach of Chinese jurisdiction. In conclusion, the understanding induced by this game world telepresence may be either positive or negative, but it nonetheless challenges contact models based on traditional channels, whether it's online or offline. Thank you. That's my presentation.
If we could come up to the front and open it up for questions.
I just have sort of a random question about whether any of you know if Chinese WoW players tend to roll Horde more than Alliance, if you're familiar with WoW, because Horde within the game narrative are sort of the underdogs or the other of the game world or the game lore, and I'm just wondering if anybody would know if there's a preference for Horde over Alliance.
Yes, we heard, I haven't done any research on this yet, but we do hear stories, and a lot of people say for sure that Chinese players actually prefer Horde. Yes, and in a pretty large proportion of them are in, and Taiwanese players prefer alliances more, but I'm not sure this is the case because we don't have any evidence to show that.
Nick Yee has done a lot of surveys about this kind of thing, you know, whether women or men prefer different character types. Healers, yes, women do prefer those. Warriors, yes, men do prefer those. But as far as whether a racialized minority within a country chooses a minoritized avatar identity, I don't think anyone knows about that. Partly because it's hard to get racial data on players, and also, you know, what a racial minority is varies a lot depending on the context of where the game is being played. So I know that there's pretty robust findings that in the US anyway, more hardcore players play it for longer sessions and stuff tend to prefer Horde. But whether that has anything to do with minority status or feeling like an outsider alienation within a context, I don't know. But yeah, that's true. I mean, when I rolled my first character, I knew I could not play an alliance character. There's just no way. They were, you know, the kind of legitimizing identity of the world, and maybe it's got to do probably with personal disposition. But it's an interesting question.
Even until yesterday, though, I mean, this was before characters.
Yeah, that's true. And they're also, I think that the gestures of the Tauren are more cinematic. because they're bigger. So you can see, it's more like pantomime. If you're making a film using World of Warcraft, I imagine you want the broadest possible gestures you could get because there isn't a lot of facial expression in WoW. In other games like Half-Life, like there's way more you can do with faces, but with WoW, not so much.
Well, a lot of people say though that Horde characters are overpowered because they have better ratios. So with the choice, the overall preponderance of Horde characters on most servers is actually a result of PvP imbalance. So I don't know if that holds true, but it's at least the general statement of the gaming community that we know.
For Holin, so do you see parallels with other kind of immigrant experiences in terms of the Chinese players on the Taiwanese servers? I mean, is it similar in the sense that I think Nick Yee's talked about it as well, about early Chinese immigrants to California and their experiences with racism and so on, or are the changes? Are the interactions and the kind of acceptance among some people accelerated, or do you see it just kind of as a similar experience to what many people who leave their homeland, so to say, and move somewhere else are experiencing?
You mean parallel to the real life?
Yeah, I mean, what kind of do you see similar parallels with what happens with other immigrants, or is it different in WoW?
Well, I think in the game world, you have a lot of structural factors, as I mentioned, that affecting the consequences. So, for example, Hong Kong players. Actually, there are quite a number of Hong Kong players in Taiwan server, but because of their they're relatively small in number, they are keeping a very low profile. Most of the Taiwanese players could not identify Hong Kong players, but they could identify Chinese players. And I think that has a lot to do with their cultural similarities, and they tend to use English more often than the Chinese players, and also their relative ratios, population ratios. But I would be hesitated to jump into real comparisons of real life migrations because I'm not experts on that aspect. So,
could the panelists please hold the microphones close to your mouth?
Okay, I thought.
Those mics.
I have a question. One thing to kind of maybe to piggyback on that, while Petrus, Rachael, and Lisa's papers dealt with this binary between East and West, Holin's was talking about a binary that was created between Taiwan and China, yet I heard the term like swarm invasion used in both contexts, and I'm just wondering if any of the panelists want to speak on sort of these questions of like yellow peril, model minority, Orientalism, New Orientalism, the association of the invader with abject labor versus with techno-economic modernity, and how these all somehow manage to function simultaneously, as well as not just within the East-West binary, but within the Taiwan-China binary, perhaps with different allegiances supposed between East and West.
Well, that's a really eloquent question and really well put. I think that what you can see in all of the papers and a lot of the struggle for coherence, I think, in some of these shared spaces between East and West, but also between different ethnicities and nationalities in Asia, is the sense of a game having a cultural plurality. That whenever you have individuals who are living their lives online, in some respect, the balance, game balance is a big issue. And I think game balance is both a game mechanic, but it's also a cultural mechanic as well. that, I think in your research, there was a tipping point where it became too Chinese, right? So that it's okay to have a representative number as long as it's not too many. And I think that's very interesting because that's the discourse of tokenism in the U.S., that multiculturalism in the U.S. is an ethic which has somewhat fallen away, but multiculturalism is about having some, but not too many. Right? That's what a token is. You have to have enough to kind of inoculate yourself against charges of exclusionary practice and against actual straight-up racism, but you don't want to have more than that because then there's a sense of threat, right? And so I think in some ways game balance is about that as well, always keeping threats balanced among each other, but players don't always agree about what what a plurality is or what threat is. So as long as the dominant norm is American or Taiwanese or what have you, then things seem to be okay. So if minorities can stay minorities, that works. But then when there's some kind of a shift, which I think there was for a while in WoW in 2006 and 2007 when I was doing some of my research, where all of a sudden I think American players were being inconvenienced by gold farmers, right? They had always been there, but now they became a plague. And that's how they were described, as a plague. So I think there's something in there about a kind of social metric of difference, which when it's exceeded within the world of a game, either as a mechanic or as an actual social dynamic, becomes very, conflictual. And you can see it in the media people produce and the way they have discourse with each other. I think that this is changing really rapidly, right? Because the industry of gold farming is changing, and as you say, migration is not the same online as it is offline. It's very different. I mean, migration offline has tremendous risk associated with it. The threat of death. Snakeheads are not the same as going onto a Taiwanese server. It's just not. But at the same time, I think game scholars want to insist on our relevance by saying, but those lines between the virtual and the real are disappearing. So to me, it seems that game studies needs to assert its importance by saying there's no line. It is real activity, it's not virtual activity. It is real life, it's not virtual life. Yet at the same time, there are virtual genocides going on, virtual kinds of social exclusion and othering, which are very extreme. So it seems that this needs to be straightened out, right? So it's kind of that question, is racism online real?
If I may, I have a comment on Irene's question, which I thought was a really great question, because what you did was you drew a distinction between this binarism of East and West and the idea that there might be binarism between other places, within Asia or within the West. And I think what we get out of that question is that plurality is the most important thing that we really have to keep in mind. And I think it comes back to Bonnie's paper yesterday, and this idea that you have to avoid that kind of binarism and that kind of cultural catch-all term. And I think one of the problems I have personally with dealing with racial representation and identity studies is that even the terms Orientalism and Occidentalism, they're binary terms. Those terms construct that binary, and yet we use them all the time. Many of us have been talking about the Orientalization of China. So we're doing it ourselves, and I think that we need ways to get past that East-West binary in the terms that we use. Not sure how to do that, but I thought it was very important that you raised that question.
I had another comment related to that, which is I think these binarisms are interesting. Also, you're talking about something broader, which is largely this insider-outsider status, which you see happening in lots of different virtual worlds. It was when you were reminding me of Celia Pierce's work with people who played Uru, and when it shut down, they had this discussion of where will we go, and a bunch of them went to their.com, and there was some resistance in their.com about these Uruvian invaders. And I mean, this is not like a combat-themed game at all, but some of it was related to lag and technical issues, and who are these people, and what do they want? And again, it was, and that had nothing to do with race, but it was very much like, this is our space. And it's interesting how people come to claim it as like, this is our space, and who are you? And if you can prove you're sort of like us, maybe you're okay, but if you're different, in some way. And you also see this with, I think, gender as well, and the rise of social and casual games, and how a lot of male hardcore gamers describe them as not real gamers, and they're destroying the space either in traditional games, or the rise of casual and social games means somehow that the next Black Ops will not get made, even though it was the best-selling game ever. But that we continue to draw these lines about insider and outsider, and like Lisa's saying, if you can prove somehow that you fit in and there are just enough of you, it's okay. But if you show up en masse, then that's a problem.
Yeah, I think there's this immense struggle over the meaning and identity of gaming right now, and that's why this conference is so relevant, is that it's been viewed as mainly a U.S. struggle involving U.S. players, which is totally wrong. So I think it's very interesting that Blizzard always had a prohibition against the N-word. Always, as far as I know. You could never say that word. You could never use it as a character name. Like, there were pretty clear rules against what's called hate speech right away, but it took until 2010 for the Taiwanese to enact a similar one, but about politics, which is very interesting. I mean, there was what sounded like we would call hate speech, chink pig, but it wasn't regulated until fairly late. So there are various norms, certainly, but yeah, there's always this kind of flashpoint of there's some kind of line that's been crossed in this game about ownership or about control or about, culture, and then there's a reaction to it. But I agree, I mean, race is just one of those. It could be nation, religion, whatever. But that struggle is kind of an ongoing struggle. And I think, honestly, something that repels people who might want to study games sometimes. Because it's such a complicated terrain. And by playing a game, you're already in it in some way or another. So
I think this is really a complicated issue, and I'm afraid that my presentation will make it too simplified. I would like to add something to the binarisms within Asia and this new Orientalisms. And I think when we are talking about this in-game world, we should never forget there are real-world politics behind, on the background. So a lot of the Taiwanese players' reaction actually has a lot to do with the real-world politics that Taiwan has been under threat of political unification from China for a long time. And so this has a lot to do with the conflicts going on in the game world, but also this is not the same. I would not say this is the same as the Orientalism in a U.S. server, I would say. For example, the Go farmers. I heard several stories, and some of the experience in my own personal contact experience with the Go farmers in the game. One of the cases, one day I was flying over a map, and that map was famous for very productive if you want to go collect plants or mines, and so accidentally I initiated a conversation with another players who happens to be a Go farmer from China. After we talked a little bit, and he automatically assumed that I was a Go farmer too, because most of the people on that map are their people. So he kept on asking me how much money I made per month. I say, I do not make a living on that. But he doesn't really get it. He just thought that you must be doing this for money. And then he told me how much money he made, and he was very anxious on the amount of money he made per day, because he said that his older brother can make like triple time, and the money he made can even pay for the electricity. So that was the first time I feel like the bubble of magic circle of gaming has been bursted, and I am facing someone that is from a sweat factory, and that is one thing. And the other case is a story I was told by one of our interviewees, and he is about 17 years of teenage boys, and he was playing, and he make friends with a goat farmer, and the Chinese goat farmer kind of lectured him and tell him, you have to study hard, otherwise you end up like me. And the other story is given by several of our interviewees, and they told us that actually they received mails in the game world from goat farmers because they were selling some raw materials in bulk in very low prices. And the other goat farmers thought that they are goat farmers too. So they kind of wrote to them and asked them, don't sell the things in such a low price, otherwise none of us can make profit. What I'm saying, all these three cases are showing us that goat farmers in Taiwan server will be different than goat farmers in it because they can communicate. And that way, they are not faceless. They are not a group of people who have no face. They actually are individuals, and you can see them. So I have no theories for that, but I'm just saying that the whole picture is very complex.
I just had a question for Rachael, because I'm very ignorant about Grand Theft Auto. But I was curious about how in the game, or if in the game, you also have representations of whiteness, because that seems like it would be really hard to do. You've kind of made a case like the reflexivity kind of works as a technique for sort of equalizing ethnicity, so everybody's just at the same degree of campiness, then that works really well. But how would you do that with the unmarked term, right? So I was just kind of curious about that, and also about what's the relationship between real players, if anyone's done research on this, but the kind of racial identifications of the players and the characters. I mean, there must be a really wide range of how people identify or how important racial identification is, but I was just curious about any kind of ethnographic identification.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take the question about whiteness first. There's a number of white characters in GTA San Andreas and a number of white groups that are presented in a stereotypical sort of a way. The first, of course, is the Italian mafia, the people from Liberty City who, at the beginning of the game, CJ's just come back from Liberty City, I believe, and at one stage in the game he has to fly there and meet the Italian mafia. And they're very typical Italian mafia, like you would see in Goodfellas or Sopranos or whatever. So they're a very stereotyped group of people. The other major white character in the game, I can't remember his name, is it Polanski? The Officer Tenpenny is the baddie, the super baddie of the whole narrative, and he's voiced by Samuel L. Jackson. He's a mean black cop who's on CJ's case, basically, and his sidekick officer is, I can't remember his name, but he's a white, sort of chunky guy, and he's Polish, and he is represented in a very stereotypical working class Polish sort of way. So it's quite a specific individual sort of representation because there's no other people in the game who are like that. There's a bunch of rednecks who live out in the Badlands who act in a very hick sort of way, very uncivilized type people. But the guy that I showed you in the slide who works with CJ and Woozy Moo for the bank heist, his name's Zero, and he lives in San Fierro, and he's a computer geek. And he's really, really smart. He runs a radio control shop or something like that. So he's very, very into technology, and so he's the typical white geeky boy with the baseball cap who's now making a living out of his technological expertise. And so in terms of non-racial non-racially constructed whiteness, I guess if you can use that term. 0 would be the normative white guy. And I think he's kind of constructed to represent the gamer inside the game narrative, right? As for the relationship between real players, I've never played any of these games online. I know that GTA 4 has a popular online component, but I don't know of any research that's been done on relationships between players in the real world and online. But there is some really interesting research on racial identification between players and characters with GTA San Andreas. And there's a really great article that I can send you. I forget it now, but I have it written down somewhere, where there were 2 researchers who conducted interviews over a number of years with players of the game, and they made note of whether it was a black player or a white player and how that player responded to violence in the game. Yes, thank you. Yes, sorry.
Kurt Squire and the student.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, so Squire, if you Google Squire and violence in San Andreas, then it'll come up. Thanks.
I think it's in Games and Culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in Games and Culture. And so the way that the black players and the white players related to the characters in San Andreas was actually quite different, and they had different ideas of what violence meant for them. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I guess this is a question for probably Lisa and Petrus, but one of my questions is, you were talking about the difference between being a consumer and a producer, and it seems like some of the current Orientalism of the Chinese is also as a consumer of e-waste, or a consumer of the waste of consumption. So it's not just being sort of the source, but also the sink in the economic life cycle, and the being the one willing to dig through the sort of waste produced by first world consumption. And I was just wondering if this, and I think it plays into the genre of RTS games in that they exclude themselves entirely from natural systems and from the question of waste. But so I guess it's sort of a question about the identification of maybe of an Orientalism associated with the consumption of waste or returning it to production.
Yeah, that's an really interesting point. I think that New Media Studies has been celebrating prosumption for quite a while, that, it's great that people will pay you basically to do work for you, right? Because every time you use Google or Flickr, you're adding value to it by making the search better, or by adding things to the archive, or otherwise fattening the database of some other company, which will then profit off of that. So there's been a kind of Marxist critique lately of prosumption as being yet another form of hyper-exploitation or extraction of value from consumers who are happy to pay for the privilege of consuming, of producing. I think the question of e-waste is a good question, because it goes back to the question yesterday of materiality, right? That underneath everything, kind of like the Banksy, couch gag, underneath everything, there is material, and there's someone who has to work in it, often in the worst, really bad conditions. So even the most abstract technologies and the most virtual kinds of media are in some ways the most toxic and the most productive of things that have to be dealt with by human hands. So when I look at the discourse around China, and even the academic discourse, there's an article on Chinese television, or a book on Chinese television by Michael Curtin that's very good, called The World's Biggest Audience. Cable TV in China, the world's biggest audience. And when I see things like Time Magazine and so on, they say the Chinese need to be better consumers. They are too good at producing. Therefore, we are in debt to them. They are not good enough at consuming. Therefore, we will never catch up. And so, going back to what you're saying about world systems, this is viewed as an imbalance, right? A violation of the pact between nations to trade in the correct way. And so e-waste, I think, is another extension of that unwillingness to consume in some ways, right? It's a form of production, that's also a form of consumption, but that it in the end is a disempowered kind of place in the production cycle, as you say. So.
That was great. Yeah.
I was still stuck in the earlier conversation we were having about the difference between race or Orientalism and politics or cross-strait politics. And I just have a small question for Holin, and I think that the scenario, the phenomenon you very vividly described for us is clearly different from racial politics in Orientalism in the United States. Because in the U.S., even though as we pointed out that the N-word is always being banned by Blizzard and the authorities, political discussion is not. You see people trolling, talking about Obama, or politics all the time. But so what is being monitored and put under surveillance in the Taiwanese case is not race in the same sense or definition as we use the term in the North American context, but something entirely different, and I think that's really interesting. And I just have a small question, because when you describe this kind of mass migration to Taiwanese servers after Wrath of the Lich King, now we know that after capitalism in particular, it is entirely possible to form small guilds that consist of no more than 10 people. And even in the older times, a guild would only take up 25 active players, or a little bit more than that. Now, so why is it exactly that Chinese migrants feel the need to blend in Taiwanese society or find acceptance by their host? Why can't 10 people from China simply form their own guild or their own kind of social culture on the Taiwanese server without needing to interact in a hostile environment with the Taiwanese, for example? And then the other not unrelated question I have is about internet cafes in Taiwan and also in China, because I think another important difference between the way people play WoW in North America and the gaming culture over there is that here a lot of people play it from home, which is a private kind of really faceless space where you can actually role play without revealing your personal identity, and living in the virtual world, if you like. But then in Taiwan and China, most people play WoW at a public space, in internet cafes, where they actually have to interact with other human beings while they're playing WoW. And I wonder if anybody has not done any research on this question and how this the physical setting or the experience of playing WoW actually impacts the social experience online as well.
Okay, I'll answer the first part. Try my best to answer the first part, and for the second part, maybe everyone else can say something. I would say even before the new expansion of Cataclysm, yes, was released, this need to blend in actually is still there. A lot of people, a lot of WoW players are, because WoW charge is the monthly subscription fee is the second highest in Taiwan. So usually the young students are not economically affordable. So the age of WoW players on average are much higher than other game players, I would say. And a lot of people I met, they're working now or looking for jobs, graduated from university or over 20. That was very different from my experience in the other game, Lineage. The average age of players was very much younger. And in that case, these players, they have their own lives. They are not just coming to play with their classmates, or everyone has the same schedule. They have different schedules. And if you want to, it's just very difficult to find everybody with the same level and same equipment, same ability to, if you want to say you are more advanced in killing some, in a certain rate, and you have finished you are the killer of the Lich King. Yes, I was. Yes. Well, that was very difficult. You have to go with others other than your friends and relatives, or your it's just very difficult. So, and especially the cataclysms make it even more so, because now the guild system has a lot of important implications. If you want to get certain things, that you can have more experience and a lot of things like that. So my experience is almost all the friends I met in the game, unless they are very resources rich, which means they are still at school. They have a whole bunch of classmates playing with them. They have to join if they want to advance in the game world. So I would say that it is not that easy just to isolate it yourself with your own group of people. Even if you want to play in the battlefield, you have no choice. Well, yes, you can organize your own teams, but most of the time, people still play with others. Yes, I think the Chinese guys are the same. Chinese players are the same too. Of course, there are regional differences. I mean, there are such a regional differences. We met a lot of Shanghai players, Shanghai and Beijing, the majority of them. Yes, but they act very differently than other players from other part of China. So it's very difficult to generalize one thing from other. But yeah, I think just leave some time.
Great. Well, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much to the presenters, and thank you to the audience. And let's continue the conversation over lunch and later in the afternoon.